As we saw in the last video, cities are often perceived as spaces with little to no biodiversity. But in reality, cities are actually spaces where many species can thrive. In this video, we will look at some of the biodiversity found in cities and the traits that make some species more likely to be able to survive in urban environments than others. Part of the reason why cities are so biodiverse is that humans have a tendency to settle in highly biodiverse areas. Many cities are in coastal areas, at major estuaries, or along major rivers, as this has allowed people to take advantage of rich soils for agriculture. These same characteristics also support high levels of biodiversity, as they tend to be areas of high net primary productivity. This map shows the overlap between the biodiversity hotspots and human population density. We have touched on the biodiversity hotspots earlier in this course, but as a reminder, they are some of the most biodiverse and threatened areas of the planet, with each having at least 1,500 species of endemic vascular plants, and each having already lost at least 75% of their original natural habitat extent. Human population density is shown in pink and purple, with the lightest pink being the lowest population densities and the dark purple areas the highest. As you can see, many of the highly biodiverse areas of the planet are also some of the most densely populated. One example of where extreme levels of biodiversity coincides with a dense and still growing city is Cape Town, South Africa. Cape Town is quite possibly the most biodiverse city on the planet. In addition to around 4 million people, Cape Town is home to over 9,000 different types of plants, and about 70% of those are endemic, meaning they are found nowhere else in the world but Cape Town. The animal life in the city is similarly diverse, with hundreds of species of mammals, insects, reptiles, and amphibians found throughout the city. In terms of conservation value, Cape Town is home to more threatened species per square kilometer than any other continental land area, and more threatened species are found in the city than in all but 6 entire countries. Table Mountain, which is pictured here, is right in the heart of the city. On its slopes, you can find over 1,500 different plant species, which is more than is found in the entire United Kingdom. Additionally, it's also home to the threatened Cape Mountain zebra and endemic ghost frogs and sugarbirds. Throughout the city, there are countless examples of unique species, some of which are confined to just one single patch of fynbos, or in at least one case, only found along a single highway interchange. The high levels of biodiversity in Cape Town is because the city overlaps with almost the entirety of the Cape Floristic region, which is the smallest of the world's 6 floral kingdoms, and the only one to be entirely contained within one country, let alone virtually only in one city. For context, Nova Scotia is in the whole Arctic Kingdom, which covers the entire temperate, boreal, and Arctic regions of North America, Europe, and Asia. Although Cape Town is an extreme example, there are plenty of cities around the world that are home to unique species. In a 2019 paper, Kylie Soanes and Pia Lentini from the University of Melbourne looked at the species that are restricted to urban areas in Australia. They found that 39 species are found in Australian cities and nowhere else in the world. Some of them are shown in the graphic here from their paper and include giant gum trees, orchids, and even a tortoise. Just as we saw with the Cape Town example, they note that sometimes cities are the last chance to save a species. These examples, plus many more from around the world, remind us that biodiversity in the city is more than just the typical pigeons and rats that we picture when we think of city wildlife, though these species can also play an important role in urban ecosystems. The key lesson here is that unique and endangered species aren't all tucked away in national parks or deep in the dense forest. Many of them are found hiding in plain sight amid the hustle and bustle of cities. They are found along roadsides, sewage treatment plants, schools, airports, and hospitals. Although these are not the typical places that we picture when we think about conservation, they are opportunities for conservation that should be taken advantage of and included in conservation planning. We can think about species and their relationships with urban areas on 2 different but related spectrums, which you can see here in a graphic based on a figure from a paper led by Erica Spotswood, which is in our supplemental readings this week. Urban areas will either provide more or less habitat resources than their surrounding landscapes, and species will exhibit a certain tolerance towards urban areas, ranging from highly sensitive to incredibly tolerant of urban areas. Some species will avoid cities completely, being extremely sensitive to urban areas and finding less resources in the city than they could elsewhere. These species tend to have narrow ecological niches and require some type of habitat that is just not compatible with urban areas, like old-growth forest, and they tend to be highly sensitive to the presence of humans in urban areas. Examples of species that would fall into this category would be cougar and lynx. Others will actively seek out urban life, finding more resources in the city than in surrounding landscapes, and being highly tolerant of human presence. Some of these species, like Norway rats, have become so well adapted to cities that they are what we call urban dependents. They are found pretty much nowhere else besides urban areas. Others, like raccoons, still exist in places outside of cities, but they have become so well adapted to urban landscapes that their population densities and chances of survival are higher in cities than in forests. Species that actively select for urban habitats tend to be generalist because they can exploit a wide variety of habitats and can take advantage of a number of different food sources. They also tend to be relatively smaller and quick-moving animals, which helps them avoid conflict with people. Most species fall somewhere in the middle of these two extremes, using urban areas occasionally, with their use of city landscapes either limited by their sensitivity to human presence or by the resources they find in the city. Many migratory birds will use cities as stopover sites if the specific type of tree they prefer is commonly planted along city streets, but they are sensitive to humans, so they will only do so if there are more of these trees in the city than in the surrounding landscape. Black bears typically find fewer resources in the city compared to surrounding landscapes, but they are so tolerant of humans that they will take advantage of the resources in the city anyway, at least on occasion. From a conservation perspective, we can think about species in terms of the degree to which they actively select urban areas and how their reproductive success or survival in cities compares to their survival in non-urban landscapes, which you can see in this graphic, which is also adapted from the paper led by Erica Spotswood mentioned on the last slide. It's really important to note that just because a species is found in urban areas, it doesn't mean that they prefer cities, or even that they are particularly well adapted to life in the city. For some species, which are represented by the bottom row of this graphic, life in the city results in lower reproductive success and survival than would be the case in a non-urban landscape. For some species, the city is an ecological trap. Individuals are attracted to the area because of what appears to be high-quality habitat. They actively come to the city for some reason or another, but in the end, they end up facing a higher mortality rate than they would if they had gone to some other non-urban available habitat. This may be because the city was rich in one resource, like a good availability of nesting sites, but poor in another, like prey species. This was found to be the case with the European kestrel in Vienna. Cities may also act as an ecological trap for highly persecuted species, like field mice or black bear, which may be more likely to be killed in areas with more people. Other species that are struggling in cities didn't choose to be in urban areas. The city was built on their habitat, but they continue to persist in remnant habitat patches that survive the urbanization process. These are called the last chance species because cities represent the last chance to conserve them. Cities are their last stronghold. This includes a lot of the species that we looked at earlier in the Cape Town and Australian examples, including the Table Mountain ghost frog, which is pictured here. It is important to point out that even though these species are persisting, they are not necessarily thriving, and in some cases they are barely hanging on, leading some experts to say that it may only be a matter of time before they go extinct. On the other hand, some species really do thrive in cities, whether they tend to actively choose urban habitats or not. Those species that do not actively select for urban habitats may represent an opportunity for urban conservation measures, as they are likely to benefit from interventions that improve or increase their habitat in urban areas. For example, research in the Washington, D.C. area showed that although they don't seem to actively seek out urban habitat, the American robin, gray catbird, northern cardinal, and song sparrow all exhibited peak survival in urban areas compared to less developed landscapes. Finally, there are those species that likely don't need many, if any, conservation interventions in cities. These are the species that actively benefit from urban habitats, like coyotes and raccoons. They actively select for urban habitat and have higher reproductive and survival success in cities compared to other landscapes. Urban areas are also drivers of evolution, and some species have adapted and pretty quickly to the uniqueness of cities. There are plenty of examples of directional selection for certain traits that increase the chance of survival in urban areas. For instance, some songbirds have adjusted to the noise of the city by singing at a higher pitch than their cousins in less developed settings. And work by Jason Munchie South and his lab at Fordham University has shown that some white-footed mice in New York City have evolved mechanisms to help them better digest the fatty foods that humans drop in parks and on the street. Some mammals have adapted to hunting at different times to better avoid potential conflict with people, and some birds have developed shorter and narrower wings in urban areas, which makes it easier for them to jump up and get out of the way of cars. Overall, cities are just really unique environments. Sometimes the species become so well adapted to urban life that they stop living elsewhere. Pigeons and raccoons are some of the best examples of this. Neither of them evolved in cities, but today neither of them are really found anywhere else. Cities can also result in some really weird and wonderful cases of evolution that produce really unique species. For example, there is a species of mosquito that lives in the London Tube, the London subway system, and nowhere else on Earth. A mosquito doesn't sound like much, and they aren't the most exciting animal on the planet, but this is an example of just how little we know about the plants and animals that live in cities. There are probably tons of other examples like the London Tube mosquito, we just don't know about them. It's only really been in the last 30 or so years that scientists have begun to pay attention to the biodiversity of cities, but in that time we've learned so much. There is also a tendency to underestimate how much biodiversity is found in the city. Like I mentioned, we are really just at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to our understanding of the biodiversity in the city, and I think we also overlook how many places there are for plants and animals in the city. When we think about urban biodiversity, we often think about parks and nature reserves, the places that look like they aren't built by humans. But this is only a small portion of the places where we can find life in the city. There are lots of what we call unconventional green spaces, which we will look at in more detail in the next video.